Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Cornfield, Antietam's Bloody Turning Point, by David A. Welker, narrated by L.J. Ganser. Whoever stood in front of the cornfield at Antietam needs no praise. Major Rufus Dawes, 1862. Prologue. It was just after 6 in the morning. Back home in New York and Pennsylvania, the men's families were just rising for the day's work on the farm, to open the shop for business, or for breakfast before school. Their day ahead might be filled with the routine hum of daily life in 1862, but these men had entered a surreal existence where even simple acts carried an odd and ominous significance. They clambered over Miller's sturdy rail fence, each front-rank man picking his own row. Sliding into the thick corn seemed to sweep away the fatal landscape they'd just escaped. For a few moments, at least, no more shells burst around them, and even the sound of their own Union batteries was nearly absorbed by the full green leaves that washed their sweaty faces in passing. As if diving into a green sea of plants, it swallowed them whole, and they could neither see out nor be seen beyond this fragile, temporary state of existence. For a few minutes at least they were lost in this cornfield, yet on they pressed, each soldier maintaining his dress with the man on either side, listening for commands from the voices of their now familiar officers. The loose Maryland dirt pulling at their boots, and the stalks grabbing at equipment slung over their shoulders, trying to steal a bayonet from its scabbard here and wrest a tin cup away from its owner there. Regardless who won each of these tiny struggles, on they pressed to the southern end of the field where, as they all by now knew, the enemy waited. Chapter 1. Planting the Seed of a Campaign. Tuesday, September 2nd, 1862, dawned bright and clear on the rolling hills of western Maryland. David Miller was likely up early that morning, working as usual around his small but prosperous farm. Known to all by his initials, D.R., could consider himself lucky in comparison to most of his neighbors, because not only had his wealthy father, 1812 war veteran Colonel John Miller, originally financed the farm, but he provided a safety net few other farmers enjoyed. This boost and hard work had been providing David and Margaret Miller and their children a solid living for many years. The Millers' farm sat about 1/2 mile north of the quiet hamlet of Sharpsburg, Maryland, straddling the Hagerstown Pike that ran north out of town. Across the pike, the first sight greeting D.R. each morning as he walked from the house was his sizable barn, with its attached single-story extension. The acres he owned on the eastern side of the road that year had held the straw and hay to sustain his livestock through the winter. But by September, these were gathered in huge stacks across the road from his house. On the eastern side of the Hagerstown Pike stood the Millers' small but comfortable 2-story whitewashed house, behind which sat a separate kitchen reflecting the home's early 1800s origin, replaced now by a modern in-house kitchen, and a small building first created as a blacksmith's shop by a previous owner. Along the road was a spring house that provided the family's water, located about halfway between the barn and the house. Behind the main house and 2 outbuildings stood an orchard from which Margaret Miller could put some treats on the table throughout the year. The nearby garden was planted in pumpkins, potatoes, and beans, although by September much of its bounty was already canned for the coming winter. The bulk of D.R.'s land, though, lay on the eastern side of the road behind the farmstead. The northernmost field was plowed in an effort to turn the remains of its already harvested crops into fertilizer by the time of spring planting. The next field to the south, directly behind the house, was a 20-acre plot then covered in grass, and probably a pasture for the cattle to graze in. Another pasture, this one nearly 40 acres, stood on the southern end of Miller's land, and sloped down gently to border the Smoketown Road and the Mooma family's farm. Skirting the farm to the north, east, and west were woodlots that D.R. owned completely or in part, which offered his animals shelter and provided the farm a plentiful source of wood for fence rails and to serve the miller's home. In nearly the center of D.R.'s property stood a 24-acre field, situated partly on a small hill, and this year planted with corn. Surveying his cornfield, D.R. might have felt a mix of satisfaction and dread. By September, this crop was green and tall, bearing many thousands of nearly ripe ears that awaited harvest, before being stored in the corn crib that doubled as a wagon shed. Harvesting crops was a back-breaking task, so difficult that its completion was celebrated in many farming communities with a social gathering, often held more out of relief than in thanks for a generous bounty. Some young men so hated this chore that they fled to join the Union or Confederate armies just to avoid this annual burden. Seeing the morning sun glisten off the rainwater on the tall, waving corn stalks this clear September morning could only have reminded D.R. that a long, difficult job lay before him in the coming weeks. David Miller had no way to know that in 2 weeks' time his rich, ripe cornfield would become the most dangerous place to be on earth. That Tuesday morning, Robert E. Lee woke in his new headquarters on the Little River Turnpike near Chantilly, Virginia, and was instantly greeted by pain. Both wrists still throbbed with a constant, sharp ache from having been thrown to the ground by his horse Traveler nearly 3 days ago. The injury, severely sprained wrists, the surgeon said, wasn't unbearably painful, but Lee remained unable to manage a horse and had arrived in an ambulance. He was here because Jackson's command reached just this far the previous day in an effort to cut off John Pope's Union army from its capital. Jackson had become bogged down in a fight near Ox Hill that had ended at dark after a violent rainstorm. Sunrise on September 2nd revealed that the Yankees had slipped away and were once again between the Army of Northern Virginia and Washington. Even so, Lee's plan might be revised and resurrected, but he needed information about the position and state of the enemy before anything further could be decided. In response, Lee directed Major General Jeb Stuart's cavalry to probe the new Union position around Fairfax Courthouse. As morning wore on, Lee received 2 unsettling pieces of news. The first being that Union Major General Philip Kearny had been killed the previous day in the battle the men were calling Ox Hill. Lee had known Kearny from the Mexican War, and after directing that Kearny's boots, sword, and other personal effects which had found new owners be turned in, they were eventually shipped to Kearny's widow, directed his aide, Major Walter Taylor, to escort Kearny's body through the lines under a flag of truce. The second piece of news Lee received was more unsettling and of greater immediate consequence. Stuart's cavalrymen reported the Yankees had retreated beyond Fairfax Courthouse and were moving into the Washington defenses. Lee well knew that attacking these strong fortifications would be too costly and that besieging the city was beyond the means of his tired and hungry army. His effort to bag Pope's army had failed. Lee, however, knew his next step even before learning this news. That afternoon, Lee boarded his ambulance and journeyed the half-mile or so to Jackson's headquarters in the Stuart family house, Lyndon Lee. There, Lee informed Stonewall that the time had come to implement the invasion of the North that Jackson had advocated for months. Jackson's original plan, spawned during his incredible Shenandoah Valley campaign that spring, proposed marching on Pennsylvania with his independent command. Lee and Davis had liked the plan, but not the timing. Reaching Richmond in early June, when McClellan's army was banging on the doors of the Confederate capital itself, Jackson's command was needed instead at Richmond. The plan remained on the Confederate table, however, awaiting the right time to put it in action. With the Federal army falling back to Washington, leaving open the path to Maryland and Pennsylvania, Jackson could only be pleased that his plan was being adopted. Although Lee listened to General Jackson, who advised him to go into the valley and cross the Potomac at or above Harper's Ferry, cleaning out the enemy forces at Winchester, the situation on the ground was different now, and Lee had broader objectives than those Jackson outlined months earlier. Lee instead ordered Jackson to take command in advance and cross in Loudoun County and move toward Frederick, Maryland, destroying the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. September 2, 1862, would be recorded as the start of Lee's Maryland campaign. The following day, while his men rested, Lee turned his attention to Richmond. Earning President Davis's approval for the Maryland invasion was critical, even though Lee already had his conditional support. "The present seems to be the most propitious time since the commencement of the war for the Confederate Army to enter Maryland," wrote Lee. "If it is ever desired to give material aid to Maryland and afford her an opportunity of throwing off the oppression to which she is now subject, this would seem the most favorable time." His plans revealed, Lee next explained the risky move's timing. "The two grand armies of the United States that have been operating in Virginia, though now united, are much weakened and demoralized." Lee must have hoped this would convince Davis of the wisdom of his Maryland plan for advancing Confederate strategic objectives, and persuade him that nothing useful would be gained by attacking or besieging Washington. Richmond's goal for the war remained, as it had from the beginning, simply securing Southern independence. In the war's early days, achieving this goal had been pinned on winning one decisive battle. When the Union Army arose from the ashes of defeat at First Manassas, Southern strategists quickly adopted a new approach. This new strategy, like the very goal of the Confederacy itself, drew inspiration from American rebels a generation before seeking independence from Britain. Like Washington and his compatriots, for whom French entry altered the war and ensured success, President Davis sought help from a major European power, chiefly Britain or France. Their diplomatic recognition, it was hoped, would set the stage for military support, particularly breaking the Union naval blockade, and with it the Northern public's will to fight. If troops from either or both powers joined Confederate armies in the field, or independently opened a second front against the Union, the tables of manpower and resources would be turned, and Lincoln would have little choice but to accept Southern independence, through a negotiated peace or military defeat of the North. Initially, Richmond used the South's main leverage over the Europeans, cheap cotton, the staple of each nation's textile industry, to prod Britain and France toward breaking the Union naval blockade. When that failed because London deemed the blockade lawful, Richmond backed away from economic blackmail to more closely following the American Revolution's example, seeking diplomatic recognition as a first step to intervention. Richmond also believed recognition would spur Northern peace advocates, deridingly referred to as Copperheads throughout the North, to press for peace, resulting in Southern independence. "Our recognition would be the signal for the immediate organization of a large and influential party in the Northern states favorable to putting an end to the war," noted Confederate Secretary of State Judah P. Benjamin. Because Richmond assumed other European nations would follow a British or French lead, it expected to negotiate treaties with other nations as well, increasing prospects for foreign military aid. General Lee, knowing a long war favored the North's manpower, supply, and financial advantages, had long supported such European intervention, and he eagerly welcomed the Confederate diplomatic Second Front. Although support existed in both Britain and France for these efforts, it was viewed there mostly as a means to suit European objectives. British and French politicians welcomed America's sectional divide, hoping that breaking the United States into two or more parts would preclude the emerging nation from competing with Europe's global strategic and economic dominance, and the Times of London in August 1862 crowed that the United States' breakup would represent the riddance of a nightmare. In London, this view was partly driven by a sentimental, inaccurate view of the South as the true heir to British nobility in North America. Although slavery was highly unpopular among all British classes, the peculiar institution didn't cloud popular support for the Confederacy, and British disdain for stereotypes of the North's tight-fisted, heartlessly capitalistic Yankees portrayed in English newspapers and popular fiction only aided the South. The same could be said for the view of most Frenchmen in explaining their support for the Confederacy. However, turning this political support into troops on the battlefield, or even just formal diplomatic recognition, was proving more difficult than Southern officials expected. British politicians had made it clear to Confederate envoy to Britain James Mason that recognition required proving the South's staying power on the battlefield, a requirement Paris echoed. The importance of military victory was known to the Yankees, too, and the New York Times wrote in February, "If our armies now advancing shall generally be stopped or beaten back, France, England, and Spain will make haste to recognize Jeff's Confederacy as an independent power." The South indeed had done its best to fulfill that requirement, but Union victories at Forts Henry and Donelson undid the progress of Manassas and other Southern wins. Mason wrote to Richmond that the news of these defeats had an unfortunate effect on the minds of our friends here. Although prospects for formal recognition seemed dim, news of twin Southern victories turned these hopes on a dime. The results of Jackson's Valley Campaign and Lee's victory in the 7 Days fight — Europe viewed McClellan's change of base as a decisive Union failure — reopened prospects for British and French recognition. At the same time, a Confederate cotton embargo was beginning to hurt British and French economies, throwing thousands out of work for lack of raw materials. In response, local press renewed pressure for London and Paris to intervene and end the war. Napoleon III even told Confederate envoy to Paris, John Slidell, that accounts of the defeat of the Federal armies before Richmond prove that re-establishment of the Union is impossible. 3 days later, the French leader sent a telegram directing his foreign minister, then visiting London, to ask the English if they believed the time had come to intervene in the American war. A member of the British Parliament responded to this renewed support for the South by introducing a motion on July 18, 1862, for the British government to join France in offering mediation to end the war. Just when the motion seemed sure of approval, Prime Minister Palmerston implored Parliament to let the Cabinet instead decide when, though not if, to mediate. The Prime Minister's short speech did the trick, and the motion was withdrawn. Palmerston made it clear that what would trigger intervention was tangible proof the Confederacy was a truly viable military partner. 1 or 2 more military victories was what he needed. Disappointed the motion had failed, James Mason remained optimistic Richmond could expect intervention in some form. This news persuaded Richmond it stood poised to finally obtain the European intervention it so desperately needed to secure independence. Just as the American victory at Saratoga had persuaded Paris to join the war in support of colonial independence, what the South needed now was one more great military victory. President Lincoln and his cabinet fully understood the South's strategy for securing independence and were doing their best to counter it. Like Lee, the president understood that a long war enabled the North's advantages, particularly in manpower and manufacturing, to outlast and overwhelm the South, and Lincoln's administration had early on developed a two-pronged war strategy: establish a naval blockade to starve the Confederacy's economy and war machine, while simultaneously launching a series of land campaigns to break the South's ability and will to fight. This sea-land strategy depended heavily on maintaining the Union's advantages in economic and military power. And although the South itself could do little to alter this state, British or French entry to the war might undo Washington's efforts almost overnight. The United States' minister to Britain, Charles Francis Adams, had led a diplomatic campaign for months opposing his Confederate counterpart, James Mason's work, but Adams could do little more than filter the news of war's developments. He could not change the facts arriving from North America, which, since June 1862, had only undermined his efforts. Adams repeatedly warned Washington that the issue of British, and therefore European, intervention turned on the outcome of the land war. Until the Confederate Army was crushed, any relief from this threat was temporary. Lincoln realized that leaving the nation's fate solely in the hands of his less-than-dependable generals, McClellan and Pope, risked disaster, and so some other means must be found to forestall European intervention. Soon it became clear that these means had been available all along, waiting only to be discovered. I cannot imagine that any European power would dare to recognize and aid the Southern Confederacy if it became clear that the Confederacy stands for slavery and the Union for freedom, Lincoln commented in January 1862. This one simple, obvious statement summarizes what became the Union's new approach to denying Richmond's means for turning the strategic tables. Once the North's war aim became a quest for freedom, Europeans would have little alternative but to leave the North alone to continue the war for however long in whatever way it saw fit. President Lincoln now had a practical reason to advance emancipation of America's slaves. Ending slavery had two other equally practical benefits for the Union. First, it would exacerbate the Confederacy's manpower shortages. The South depended heavily upon slaves to free soldiers from mundane but important manual labor duties, digging trenches, driving wagons, etc., to serve as armed combatants. Offering slaves working for the Confederate Army new incentives to flee would deny the enemy their services, thinning Southern ranks by diverting soldiers to perform these tasks. Ending slavery also would free the Union Army to fight an aggressive, no-holds-barred style of war. So long as the war's objective was to preserve the Union in its pre-war state, Washington could not afford to destroy the South's economy and strike at civilian targets, fearing doing so would complicate reintegration. Freeing the slaves sent a message that events had progressed beyond the point of restoring the Union as it was, and that the war was taking a more aggressive turn, a change Washington was driving. President Lincoln had long personally opposed slavery, but understood the Constitution prohibited imposing his views on the entire nation. "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong," Lincoln famously wrote to a friend, but then added, "I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling." Lincoln's need for support from congressional Democrats and leaders in border states, where slavery remained economically and socially important, early on had worked to protect the institution. By early 1862, however, Lincoln's personal inclinations had aligned with the nation's vital interests. In March 1862, Lincoln fired the first shot of this political battle by urging Congress to support a joint resolution offering special aid to any state which may adopt gradual abolishment of slavery. Aimed not at Europe, but instead at stopping Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri's flirtations with joining the Confederacy, the resolution also sought to deny Southern territorial expansion. The measure was vigorously opposed by border state congressmen, however, who met with Lincoln on March 10th to express their displeasure. The meeting ended amicably, though coolly, demonstrating that Lincoln still faced considerable obstacles to emancipating the slaves, even if doing so was now vital to saving the Union. By late spring and summer 1862, the rising threat of European intervention increased the strategic need and political will for emancipation, prompting the president to act. Lincoln reconvened the border state congressmen on July 12th to offer one last chance to willingly accept emancipation. Lincoln summarized the situation bluntly, stating if they did not make a decision to emancipate gradually, the institution in your states will be extinguished by mere friction and abrasion. But this meeting ended much as had the March gathering. Faced with looming threats of foreign intervention and his failure to persuade border state leaders, Lincoln apparently decided that night that the time had come to announce general emancipation, grounded in his executive powers to seize enemy property, the slaves themselves, being used to wage war on the United States. Lincoln shared his plan to announce general emancipation with Secretary of State William H. Seward and Navy Secretary Gideon Welles on July 13th, while riding to the funeral of Secretary of War Stanton's infant son. Lincoln described it to Welles as a military necessity, absolutely essential to the preservation of the Union. We wanted the Army to strike more vigorous blows. The administration must set an example and strike at the heart of the rebellion, commented the President. Regardless, if Lincoln was informing his secretaries or testing the waters, the die was cast. Slavery would be legally abolished in the United States. In a July 22nd meeting, Lincoln informed his cabinet of the decision. Only Postmaster General Blair, a former Democrat and the most conservative of Lincoln's inner circle, opposed the move. Secretary of State Seward expressed full support, but cautioned he would withdraw this if the Emancipation Proclamation was publicly announced in the coming weeks. Only 2 weeks before, the Army of the Potomac had narrowly escaped defeat at Malvern Hill, and now lay immobile, backed to the James River, and with little prospect of advancing on Richmond. In Europe, these developments played poorly. Despite support for emancipation prospects, European press decried the recent drive to this end as the last gasp of a defeated government. "Until you can give it to the country supported by military success," counseled Seward, "it would seem as the last measure of an exhausted government, a cry for help, our last shriek on the retreat." Seward's advice struck me with great force, noted the President, and he changed course. The Emancipation Proclamation would remain in Lincoln's drawer until the Union had a military victory to back up this shrewd political and social move. If Lincoln was frustrated about repeated Union military failures, Major General George B. McClellan shared the President's concern, but for a very different reason, because the past few weeks had been trying for the Army of the Potomac's young commander. General McClellan arose in his house on Washington's H Street on September 2nd, secure in the knowledge of Pope's defeat, and that as his professional rival's troops came into the Washington defenses, they automatically fell under his command. None of this prepared him for the visitors interrupting his breakfast. President Lincoln and Commander of the Union Army Major General Henry W. Halleck, after being ushered in, expressed the opinion that the troubles now impending could be overcome better by me than anyone else. Pope is ordered to fall back upon Washington, and as he re-enters, everything is to come under my command again. A terrible and thankless task, yet I will do my best, with God's blessing, to perform it. In the face of another major defeat, not 20 miles from the capital, Lincoln had little choice. For better or worse, George McClellan once again commanded the Union's main army in the East. Few men possessed more solid military credentials than Major General George B. McClellan. Despite recent setbacks on the peninsula and challenges dealing with official Washington, McClellan's combination of energy, unequaled recent field service, old Army experience, personal intelligence, mastery of military strategy and art, support both high and low throughout the Army, and bearing and gentlemanly pedigree made him the obvious candidate for the job. Had observers been able to look behind George McClellan's professional accomplishments and public facade to understand his character and innate personality traits, however, many in McClellan's legion of supporters might have reconsidered the wisdom of restoring him to command. George Brinton McClellan was born December 3, 1826, in Philadelphia, the third child of Dr. George McClellan and Elizabeth Steinmetz Brinton McClellan. His mother provided young George an excellent classical education, 4 years in one of Philadelphia's best private schools, a year with a private tutor, with whom he spoke only French and Latin, and at 11 years of age entry to a preparatory program at the University of Pennsylvania. That unique experience well prepared George to enter West Point On July 1st, 1846, a day the 15-year-old McClellan...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?